Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another episode on Swole Radio. Today I'm joined again by Dr. Eric Helms, which we're very lucky to have. He's one of the founders of 3DMJ, a pillar in the science-based bodybuilding community, and also conspicuously known for ownership of several great monuments in Egypt. How are you doing, Eric?
Well, the legal battle continues as to whether or not we actually get to claim ownership over the Great Pyramids because I wrote my book. But I'm hopeful, so I'm in a good mood. I'm doing well. Glad to be back on.
Let the naysayers speak.
Yeah, I mean, the haters can have their voice, but ultimately, when I'm sitting on top of the pyramids, which would probably be very uncomfortable, pointy, they'll understand the truth.
So today we're going to be talking about a very fun topic, and that is exercise selection. I think this is something that never gets old. And I think it's interesting how I feel that your interest in exercise selection kind of goes through a couple of waves as you progress in experience. I think beginners are often very obsessed with exercise selection. You know, what's the best exercise to build your chest or your biceps? And then a lot of people, when they get into the science-based sphere, they kind of drop it and they say, oh, you know what? It doesn't matter. And you know what matters? All that matters is volume or something like that.
Mm.
And then you kind of become more experienced and you really start seeing how you can make minute changes to movements and your programming and really feel it in your body. So today we're going to be delving in deep into this really fun topic and answering a lot of frequently asked questions. So I just wanted to start off, Eric, maybe by getting your open perspective on criteria that you like to use when choosing the best exercises.
Yeah, I think I like the way you framed it, in that we often get focused on like the programming variables, which are relatively stable across exercises. And I think that can have people think, well, then exercise selection is of lesser tier of importance, or that it's not important. But it's one of those things where, like, that's an accurate assumption if you have a good spread of exercises and you have good technical execution of the exercises, then all that's true. But those are assumptions that I think probably shouldn't be made in all cases. There's a lot of people who
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily have access to everything, or aren't able to perform certain exercises. So, yeah, I think from a bodybuilding perspective, like you need a fair amount of variety if you are trying to maximize muscle growth in all the various heads and muscle groups. Um, and while the general principles hold true regardless of which exercise you're dealing with some caveats, it's still really important, because if you are not able to execute an exercise properly, you can develop kind of like these consistent weak points in your physique, which are relatively obvious and easy to fix, despite the
Mm-hmm.
fact like you're doing a lot of things right in terms of your programming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of my preamble, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah. So I guess maybe I'll share a little bit of my own perspectives, and then see what you think, and maybe presenting your own. So I kind of starting off, I kind of have just a very simple 5-step model when looking at how people can choose exercises for themselves. And so the first criteria is that the target muscle should be the limiting factor in the movement. Basically just saying that your exercise should target the muscle that you're trying to build. And the next one is that the exercise should give you an adequate stress over the muscle's range of motion. which I think will is range of motion is definitely something that a lot of people like to miss out on at the beginning, or when they're not well versed in technique and that. And then the next one is how amenable the exercise is to progressive overload. And the way I like to have people think about it is, if I took this exercise, could I lift in a heavy rep range, and like, could I load it up to something like a 6 to 8 rep range and get to within 1 or 2 reps in reserve? And I think that is kind of a nice way of just choosing exercises that will really give you a high ceiling in terms of overloadability over time. So you're going to be able to run that over time. It's going to give you a good challenge and relatively safe as well. So I think if someone's trying to do, like a 2RM on like a single arm reverse cable press down or something, it just might not be ideal. And the next one also relates to progressive overload, and that is looking at microloadability. And I think that microloadability is underrated in bodybuilding. I think it's something I always think about when I'm designing exercises and designing my program is, how am I going to look ahead down the line and structure this program so that I can apply a very precise overload, or at least see that overload happen. So this is where things like barbell exercises and dumbbell exercises really shine, because you can precisely control the amount of weight that you're adding. And this gives you a couple of advantages, where part of it is just being able to handle small increments in progress. So obviously for beginners, they might be able to add weight every session or very, very frequently. But as you become more advanced, even something like a 5-pound increment becomes a lot. And the last criteria is, does the exercise just feel good? And I think this is a fairly broad thing. It comprises of mind-muscle connection, which I think is important in itself. But a lot of it is just kind of how an exercise grooves for someone. And I think it's maybe a little bit hard to define and take some experience for that. But I think there's a lot of individual variation in what exercises will work for different people. And a lot of it is just trial and error, and people just need to find what feels good for them. What are kind of your thoughts?
Those are all great. When I some of the things I start with when I'm just going, all right, well, what's the basic skeleton of the structure of where we slot in exercises for all the various stuff we've talked about at this point, your volume, intensity, and frequency, is starting with basically 6 cardinal categories of movements, which, independent to some degree of your level of experience, weak points or strong points, even competitive division, except in a few spots where certain muscle groups might be totally covered up, and you could omit a few of these. But just kind of like a general hypertrophy program should probably consist of a horizontal push and pull, a vertical push and pull, some type of hip hinge, and then some type of squat. So when you do that, you've pretty much got every muscle group trained, at least to some degree, through compound movements. And then from there, that's where you can kind of start filling in gaps, because it's not that'd be a good like hypertrophy program, but it wouldn't be a great bodybuilding program in and of itself, because there are a few gaps. So just for clarity, when I say horizontal push and pull, I mean like a bench in a row as an example. Vertical push and pull could be like an overhead press and pull down. A hinge could be I have pretty broad classification categories here. That could be an RDL, a good morning. It could even be a hip thrust or a weighted back extension. And then for a squat, same thing, kind of broad categories. That could be a squat, or that could be anything really that combines simultaneous knee and hip extension. So leg press, lunges, hack squat, front squat, low bar, high bar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you just need to think about, where do I distribute those based on kind of my quote unquote split, or how do I distribute them across the days if maybe I'm doing a more full body-esque approach, or maybe not full body, but I'm just not limiting which muscle group to train on which day. Then all right, I might not have my leg press on the day right after I do hip hinging or something like that. So anyway, from there, then you need to think about, okay, well, what are all the other demands I need as a bodybuilder? And we know that when we're doing simultaneous hip and knee extension, rectus femoris doesn't need to be trained as well. So we probably need some isolation work, or quadricep emphasis that allows the rec fem to work. Some type of knee flexion movement, so we get the bicep femoris short head in there. We need some direct calf work. Most people are probably going to need some direct arm work, and you may or may not need like direct ab work, some more trap dominant stuff, etc. And you've got what ends up being a pretty complete program.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, like I think you were bringing up, and we've mentioned, is that within all the various categories, you have to consider everything you talked about. And then to your last point about kind of having a quote unquote feel for it, I think that really shouldn't be underestimated. There was a cool study done by Rausch and colleagues, I want to say 2017 or 2018. And it's specifically on the topic of auto-regulated exercise selection. And what they did is they had these two groups. Both trained 3 days a week. But in the auto-regulated group, for each of the muscle group categories, they could choose between 3 exercises on any given day. So for like their quad selection, they could do like leg press squats or leg extension. Their choice, all 3 days, same movement, all 3 days, different movements, switch it up week to week, whatever the heck they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the other group, they had a fixed order. So quads on one day was leg press, one day it was squats, one day it was leg extensions. And they had a similar thing going on for back, chest, shoulders, you name it. The important piece here was that these were relatively experienced resistance trained individuals. And the group that auto-regulated it and selected what they wanted that felt best on the day for a given muscle group, they actually got stronger and got a little bit bigger than the non-auto-regulated group. That's not to say that auto-regulation is magic, but it says that, like you said, with experience, you start to get a feel for which exercises you can perform well, feel safe on, get a good solid mind-muscle connection, and have that overloadability, as you talked about. So I think that's something that should be emphasized, and is something that will change over time. And you'll notice, like if you watch certain athletes train, they select certain exercises. Sometimes they get dogmatic and like tell everyone to do that, but I think the only thing you can really tell if you look across a cross section of a lot of bodybuilders that there is some variation, which means you're probably going to be a little different too, because we all have different lever lengths, we all have different muscle attachment sites to some degree. There's a lot of variety in what it is to be human. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that is really cool to think about, especially with that study coming out and starting to validate some of these things where, old school bodybuilders would just say, you got to feel it, bro.
Yep.
I guess,
and just even more to that point, we just coming out in the forthcoming Mass issue, Greg Nuckols reviewed an article where they looked at EMG differences between and within individuals, and looking at Nordic hamstring curls, which are like the eccentric portion of a hamstring curl, where your feet are fixed and your torso moves. And also, I believe it was RDL. So basically a knee flexion and a hip extension dominant exercise. And while the group differences were pretty solid, like, oh, this one is a little more dominant for these hamstring exercises, and they broke it down by semitendinosus, semimembranosus, bicep femoris, and these are more dominant in this exercise. Within individuals, some people were flipped, and some people were much more dominant in one than the other, which gives an indication that, yeah, we can follow these broad guidelines, but 100%, if you're someone who's like, yeah, I never feel my muscle group in X exercise, and it's also, here's a caveat that I think a lot of novices and beginners miss. It's an exercise where you should be focusing on the mind muscle connection, like not a barbell squat. Like, I don't think about feeling my quads on a barbell squat.
yeah.
When you have like a free weight, multi-joint technical movement, the focus should be on technical execution of the movement. However, when you've got something where the technical execution is relatively controlled, like maybe you're doing a heel elevated like Smith machine squat and really trying to control your eccentric tempo, pause in the hole and come back up and focus on your quads. Yeah, that's totally fine. Focus on your quads. Or obviously something like a bicep curl or a calf raise, etc. Isolation movements and movements that have been modified so that it is emphasizing how it feels. That's certainly valid, but you wouldn't take that approach on all movements, in my opinion. A lot of the times it is just about locking it in, having it be biomechanically correct, and training it. So anyway, for movements where it's appropriate to be focused on the mind-muscle connection, you're going to get people who experience pretty different things. And that's not necessarily means that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you're a little different and it may not be the best exercise for you, or you need to practice it more. So yeah.
Yeah, and going off of that, when you talk about how, some people just don't feel an exercise in a certain muscle, I was just wondering in terms of how you would go about evaluating that in a specific individual case. So I guess one set of criteria I'd like to use is kind of on a temporal basis. While you're performing the exercise, do you feel disruption in that muscle? Like, do you feel pain? Do you feel the burn, I guess? And then on a slightly longer frame throughout the workout, are you feeling a pump from that exercise? And then on a longer scale, looking at the next day or later, are you sore in the target muscle? I don't know if you have any other tips for people.
I think those are good, but they don't apply to all muscle groups. We've probably experienced
Sure.
it sometimes, especially as you're more experienced. Certain muscle groups just don't get that much of a pump, you know? Like I would love to get a lat pump like I get on my, like my biceps or my chest. But if you think about just the amount of area that is contracting, and like how much vascular occlusion, or I should say, vascular occlusion is really happening across the whole lat to create any kind of isolated pump on these movements. Well, not quite as much. I get it sometimes. Don't get me wrong. I've certainly had lat pumps, but it's never as consistent as other muscle groups. You also have to think about some muscle groups are just much less likely to get trained at long muscle lengths. If you think about the exercise that they're performed in, so they typically just don't get that sore. You know, it's rare to get trap soreness for me, I find. So yeah, those are small caveats. And then you also have to think about how long have you been doing the exercise, how much variety do you have, and what's your current training frequency? Because if you've been at it for years and you consistently do an exercise and you do it 3 times per week, you probably ain't getting that sore. You might get the pump. So there is certainly, I think that's good general advice, but I do think people should be aware that certain exercises are probably just not good candidates for that assessment. And you kind of just have to then, unfortunately, go by, did you feel it? Which is super subjective. But like you can do things like I'm going to take this set to failure, even though that's not necessarily what I would always do, and see what fails. Because I think a lot of the times when you're not feeling the target muscle, it goes back to what you said is your first criteria: is the target muscle the limiting factor? Is it the limiter? And a lot of the times on one of these compound movements, especially where this typically gets people, because on isolation movements, I find on isolation movements, most of the time, if you don't think you're feeling it, you will if you go to failure. You just realize that maybe you had different expectations, or maybe you were just further away from failure. You weren't overloading as much as you thought. I've yet to meet someone who can't feel their quads on a leg extension,
Yeah.
So, however, not feeling your lats on a lat pull down, super common, so I think when you have someone like that push to failure, they can go, oh, like I got a really intense burn in my teres major and my biceps gave out. Well, okay, now that gives some insight on what we should do. Let's try a thumb over grip. Let's get you some straps. Let's do neutral or palm over grip, and let's try to really emphasize thinking about pulling from our elbows. And then you can even have a a workout partner do, like touching the muscle group that you're trying to train to help bring a more attentional focus to it. And you can start to train through that. So a lot of those cues are things that you might only pick up over time, or with the assistance from a pretty experienced lifter. But yeah, so in some cases, I think, well, first off, I like those rules or those guidelines for when you can feel a muscle group better. But I think sometimes they won't necessarily apply in certain training constructs or for certain movements or muscle groups. And in those cases, it becomes a matter of pushing yourself to where you should see failure occur in that muscle group. And then if it does, okay, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But if it doesn't, then what do I do about it? And that's going to be context dependent.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, Eric and I have been designing a special exercise that trains the entire upper body called the Panacea Row.
I love it. You just have to essentially row the world, and the world will respond to you. Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, so yeah, I really like that. Some really applicable caveats to think about, especially when people are like, yeah, but I don't necessarily feel it in them all the time in certain exercises, especially if they're training with higher frequencies or have been using a movement for a while. Getting a little deeper and asking some other questions about general exercise selection. Common topic people will ask about is compound versus isolation movements. How do you like to rationalize sort of how to incorporate them and how much of each?
Yeah, I think there's a give and take here, because like you talked about, I want to make sure the target muscle is the limiting factor in an exercise. Well, not all exercises just have one target muscle, right? So good old compound exercises are efficient from a perspective of they train multiple muscle groups at the same time. That squat pattern is a pretty good glute and quadricep exercise. That hinge pattern is a pretty good glute and ham exercise, right? And extensor exercise. And like a lat pull down is pretty good for a number of muscles in the back as well as your biceps, right? So that is I say that's a feature, not a bug. I think with compound exercises, we're looking to get the most bang for our buck in terms of time invested and train multiple muscle groups at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the limited data we have, which isn't a lot, it suggests that you can get very similar rates of hypertrophy, especially in untrained individuals, with doing compound rather than isolation exercises. However, there's also data. The data leans in favor of, for trained individuals, you probably need to do some isolation work when you've got a synergist rather than a prime mover, if you really want to try to maximize its hypertrophy. And again, this is a lacking area of data. It's difficult. We don't have a whole lot of bodybuilders comparing, rows and pull downs to curls, but we have some data on this area, and that's kind of where the data lean. So I think the way to think of it is that compound exercises, especially free weight compound exercises, they require a whole lot of work from muscle groups that you would not expect. The complexity of functional anatomy is much more than most bodybuilders acknowledge or think about. We generally think of a couple of exercises, a couple of muscle groups work during an exercise. Like for chest, we think for bench, that's chest, triceps, and your front delts. And it's like, yeah, that's basically true. But we forget things like, oh, the long head of the triceps is a weak shoulder extensor. Oh, the biceps are actually a weak shoulder flexor, right? Oh, in a deep squat position, our adductor now acts as the primary hip extensor. So it's far more complicated than we often give it credit. And on top of that, we have co-activation. We have potential, synergist dominance, which might just be normal for someone versus someone else. That's when the target muscle group is working not as hard as one of the synergists. So, but nonetheless, like there's a lot of muscle groups that are acting as stabilizers, Some are activating in a way that you would think, well, hold on, that's the antagonist. Wouldn't that be counteracting this movement? Well, it's just stabilizing. It's just staying active to some degree. We don't think about what's being isometrically controlled. So I think if you were to try to design a program that consisted almost completely of isolation exercises and targeting specific muscle groups, that almost takes a certain level of, I would say, arrogance, to where you think
Mm-hmm.
you can move better than your body knows how to, and it almost puts this kind of muscles first mentality, when that's really not the way humans move.
Hmm.
Um, an example of this is when you look at the data on performance and internal versus external cues. So like when you think of contracting a muscle to move something and improve performance, it typically reduces power, right? Or reduces force output.
Hmm.
It's like the idea of thinking like, all right, I'm going to punch somebody, so I am going to extend my tricep and then extend my hip at the same time. Like that's a very foreign way of thinking. Like our body is meant to just execute for us. That the muscular control is somewhat subconscious, especially in a well-learned skill, and we produce more force that way. Thinking about instead of extend my tricep, thinking of I'm going to try to punch through that back. That cue would typically result in greater force output, and this has been shown in multiple studies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that anatomy and functional anatomy and what is actually active during the movement, far more complex than we realize, quite individual. And there's a lot of muscles contracting almost anytime we move or do something. So the approach of kind of those, 6 cardinal movements that I mentioned, the horizontal and vertical push and pull and the hinge and squat, that basically says, all right, I've got those there because a whole lot's going on in them when I do them. And then I can evaluate, like, is my physique lacking based on, either my anatomical structure, like for example, I have narrow clavicles. It doesn't matter how big my delts are. I could always use bigger, delts and lats because of that. So, but maybe you actually are more, skeletally built for bodybuilding, and you notice that there are certain muscle groups that are not getting developed by these core compounds, and you go, all right, well, I need to well, my lats need more work. I'm doing rows and pull downs. Maybe I need to do like a lat push down, or like find one of those mythical magical pullover machines, the Nautilus ones, which are amazing. um, so you can start to kind of fill in the gaps, and you need a little bit of understanding of anatomy to do that. So compound exercises are great because they're time efficient and because they train a whole lot of stuff and some things you're not even realizing. I think this is one of the reasons why direct abdominal work never quite pays off as much as we want it to, just because the abs act as a stabilizer so often. They're getting enough of an overlapping isometric stimulus from so many exercises that then when you start doing direct ab work, you're like, I think they grew. I don't know. I need to diet down. I can't even tell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Same thing with like traps. I haven't noticed a whole lot of putting shrugs in or out of programs over the years, and they've just kind of fallen by the wayside in my programming. Like I just don't care anymore because they don't seem to do anything. And that's not just my own personal anecdote. That's with like hundreds of bodybuilders. So there are a couple exercises I will put in if someone gets neurotic and asks for it, but that I don't really think matter because they get hit in so many other compounds. So yeah, kind of also like front delts, for example. They get hit in any press you ever do. And I rarely think someone without like a shoulder issue or an overhead pressing issue needs to be doing like front raising, for example. So that's kind of the argument for compounds. The argument against them, to kind of, strawman or steelman my position now,
Hmm.
to look at it from the other way, is that because you're training more muscle at once, the fatigue per rep is higher than it would be for an isolation movement. And sometimes you may not feel that fatigue is worth it. Like, okay, so I'm getting some extra intercostal growth here, or yeah, I'm getting some isometric abdominal work here, but why wouldn't I do an isolation movement? And I'm also crushing myself with this axial loading. Like, wouldn't it be just easier to hop on the leg press? Sometimes the answer is yes, certainly. So I think while if you took a look at a power lifter in the off season, far from a competition, they would have a fair amount of volume on their main lifts and then some accessories, and certainly more accessories, working on hypertrophy than they would when they were close to competition. They probably dropped out in favor of doing more heavier loading and the overall, linear nature of dropping volume to allow recovery and focusing on strength.
Mm-hmm.
But a bodybuilder would look even less compound dominant. We would not necessarily put, just because I mentioned those 6 compound cardinal exercises on a pedestal to where they were 80% of everything you did. They would maybe still be a dominant factor, but they're kind of given equal weight. Like, you could make the argument that a calf raise is just as important as a row for a bodybuilder, because that muscle group is judged on stage, maybe
Mm-hmm.
not quite as important because the row does a few more things, but I think you get my point in that the bodybuilder's program always needs to be relatively balanced between muscle groups. So that means that, like, you might have 3 sets of squats in a week, and then another, like, type of squat pattern, and then some isolation work for quads and 2 different exercises in a week. While that powerlifter equivalent, anytime they come in to train their quads, there's going to be a squat pattern involved of some type. And they're not even thinking about training their quads. They're thinking about
Mm-hmm.
training the squat, and then their accessories train the quads to hopefully help their squat. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
different perspective. I think you need a good foundation of compound exercises, but they should be an equal or similar proportion compared to everything else you're doing when you look at the overall program and the total volume distribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are really good points. And I like how you point out that, exercise selection is a lot more complex and does require knowledge of anatomy, where having those 6 basic movements is a really good way of just blanketing everything when you're starting someone out, just being like, okay, when you're building this program, I want you to think about these movements because they're going to cover a lot of stuff and they're going to cover a lot of ground. But, often bodybuilders will just say, I'm training back with this barbell row, like back period, when, there's a lot more that goes into it when you look at the anatomy and, just the planes of the muscle and the different muscles involved. The back isn't just one slab of meat that's, just a
a great way to confuse a bodybuilder who has a very I would say simplistic view of muscle groups and organizes their training as to, like, chest, back, shoulders, legs, arm, 2 days off kind of thing. Ask them where they put deadlifts, and the cognitive dissonance between deciding whether it goes on back day or leg day is
the
always
comment section
a
just blew
challenge.
up.
Yeah, like, what, and the best part is that they're both wrong, and so, like, and they're both right. So I think you do have to. That's why sometimes I'm not a huge fan of like the body part splits, because it forces you down these overly simplistic rabbit holes that make you put exercises together or week to week or back to back that don't allow for the best recovery and distribution of stress and stimulus.
Mm-hmm. And then, moving on to some more in terms of specifically targeting things. What are your opinions on choosing exercises based on tension curves, and how to think about that in general as a bodybuilder?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people. I mean, it does matter, but it's not one of those things that I think needs to a whole huge amount of time needs to be focused on it most of the time. I think if you understand that if you train something through a full range of motion, and that somewhere along that curve is when the tension is going to be highest for the muscle group, most exercises kind of take care of themselves. But it's not a bad idea to have some overlapping exercises where the hardest point of the movement is at different points in the range of motion. We have enough data to show, like, training at longer muscle lengths with high forces probably produces greater hypertrophy. It also produces more muscle damage, though. But that's not the only only consideration. Like, if you look at, like, BFR, you can see that if you achieve fatigue, it kind of evens out in the end in some cases. So a lot of the times I look at it from an educator perspective. Like, is this going to be is this something they can conceive of, think of, and go to the gym and apply it without making errors? And I think the likelihood sometimes is not great when you go down that rabbit hole, that it's going to be
Mhm.
applied properly. But a lot of the times I just try to emphasize, because we have great data on for almost all the studies show that using a greater range of motion um, results in greater hypertrophy. There's one study to the contrary is on the triceps, and some other findings are really confusing, like the actual size of the tricep change, and the size of the triceps measurements really don't comport with the rest of the data out there. So right
Mhm.
now it's one study with like an asterisk, and then every other study shows greater range of motion training
Mhm.
generally results in more hypertrophy.
Mhm.
And I can't think of a lot of times where you have a decent distribution of exercise selection and you train with a full range of motion and a sufficient proximity to failure where that doesn't take care of itself, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, where if you try and, put a pen to paper and try to plot out graphs and think too much ahead of time and just be like, I'm going to calculate the gains out of this row or something, that you kind of, overthink it and get lost in the trees. So I think that, yeah, sometimes a lot of the cases when you have those more basic premises that we talked about before, it kind of takes care of itself.
With that said, I think there are some times where it's something that's worth being aware of because it changes maybe where you decide to end a set. So, for example, on a row, uh, the row gets increasingly more difficult as it gets close to your body, right? So if you decide like a 10 RPE or momentary muscular fatigue is the point of technical breakdown, which is the point when you can no longer actually touch your chest without deviating in your back angle with the bar. If you ever like videotape yourself do that, and as soon as you like, if you get it like an inch away and you can't do it, just stop. The rep speed for 90% of that movement barely goes down at all. So from looking at the exercises, how close to failure was I? Yeah, you were technically at a 10, but if you were to compare it to like most other exercises, it looks like you're like a 5 RPE, you know? So is it invalid to say, well, then I kept doing rows and just let the range of motion start to dissipate? I mean, I'm still training the muscle group. I don't think that would be an invalid way of looking at it necessarily. It might be difficult to then progress and calculate as your rep distance is decreasing throughout a set as it goes on. You're doing partials, but certain movements like that, where like basically pulling movements, especially where it's not like where you're going, where the eccentric is going the other way against gravity. And like with a press, you get stuck, it's coming back to you. Like very clear when
Yeah.
you need to keep going. But a row, it just goes back to the ground or back to the machine. And yeah, you couldn't get that range. So it's you can make the argument that you probably need a little more variety in certain exercises like that, like back exercises, like maybe a push down and some pull downs where the tension curve isn't so unfavorable against you. So you can have some opportunities to, train the muscle group at, you know, through a more even strength curve, if you will. So that you can get a little more homogeneous fatigue throughout that range of motion. But yeah, I think understanding that's just useful because then you understand why does everyone cheat on rows? Why do you see like that hump, and as people like really just try to force and cheat on that last phase of that range of motion. Um, so yeah, I mean, some people would take that a step further and be like, well, all right, I want to have like a band assisted row so that it aids me at that point where I'm weakest, or I'm to use the machines where they have that variable resistance so that it matches the strength curve so it keeps it flat. But the funny thing is when you look at the little data we have on, trying to flatten out that strength curve so it's
Hmm.
always consistent, it doesn't actually. If it was true that you needed to have that constant tension and really go to failure across that whole range of motion or what have you, we would see favoring that variable resistance, and that's actually, or constant resistance, I should say, and that's not what we observe. That typically hasn't played out as a superior form of hypertrophy, despite it making sense, and we would think, because basically like accommodating resistance like bands and chains,
Hmm.
what that does is it more closely matches your strength curve, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So like just a simple example for someone who's listening, if you have bands on a squat, if you think about the squat where it's the hardest, it's in the hole, right? Where you're in a stretch position and your quad and glutes are not great at producing force, and you're having to turn around after lowering into the hole. That's where people stick, is right out of the hole. And the reason why it's not in the hole is just because of that passive contribution of the stretch shortening cycle after you initially do it, right? Or sorry, you turn around after the eccentric. So that stick in the hole, okay, well, if I have chains on the bar, when I'm in the hole, the bar's lowest to the ground, most of the chains are on the ground. So the bar is lighter. So when I'm weakest, the bar is lighter. So it's still a sufficient challenge, but that's no longer the limiting point. And then as I stand up and I get into more favorable biomechanical position, and I get more cross bridging overlap, and that length tension relationship is superior as I'm standing up. It's getting heavier, so I'm getting challenged as I'm getting stronger, and I'm getting a reduction in load, so I'm more appropriately challenged when I'm weaker.
Mm-hmm.
Yet data doesn't suggest that necessarily enhances hypertrophy. So how much that matters is unclear. So that's another reason I don't get super focused on this, is because it's one of those things that makes sense in theory but doesn't pan out in the research. So it may just not be that critically important that at every point in a range of motion, you're getting challenged. It may be that with enough exercises and the sufficient tension at the points where they are there are good enough to produce hypertrophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's an interesting thing to touch on. Where, yeah, I think when you start talking about tension versus strength curves, people most commonly start talking about cables versus free weights, and then, as you mentioned, use of chains and bands. And I think that it's important to have some sort of concept of it. And I think there are going to be some cases where people are like, oh, like, I'm totally not feeling the bottom of this triceps kickback with a dumbbell. And I think there are some cases where, as a general recommendation, I usually suggest that people have a little bit of a mix of just, of cables and free weights, just because
Yeah.
you might be able to capitalize on some parts of the muscles range of motion that you may not necessarily. But at the same time, I think if you spend 20 minutes trying to rig up a like chains and bands set up, with a squat, that as you said, you may not be able to squeeze that much out of it, really.
That's well said.
Going on a little bit more and delving in along our little tension and strength curve talk, what are your thoughts on just machines versus free weights?
I think they're really good complementary exercises. Like I think free weights, for that same reason where I was talking about it with compound movements, are great because they do require stabilization and moving in multiple planes in three-dimensional space, quote unquote. Of course, that's only space you can move in, but people know what I'm saying. Um, and for that reason, they should definitely be included. And I think you don't necessarily need to then think, oh, I'm learning how to do the power lifts necessarily. But even people who just have pure hypertrophy goals, I think it is good to have some exercises which require a more of a kind of a full body contribution and coordination, because there's probably some hypertrophy there in certain muscle groups that we're not expecting, or we can't quite predict. So they're great. I think those are some key staples that you probably want to have in your program. But a leg press, man, like a row, preacher curl machine, calf raise. I think they're leg extension, leg curl. I think there are some movements that are very difficult to find a way to replicate.
Okay, yeah.
Like how would I do a free weight isolated knee extension? It's pretty challenging. Like, you got to get like the sled out, and then you're like, well, there's no real eccentric now. Like how effective is this? And I'm tired of backpedaling around the room, So, you could do like sissy squats, but you may or may not find that's safe or coordinated or hurt your knees more than a leg extension. Yes, I said it. Some things can hurt your knees more than leg extensions, despite what the internet believes. So like
Nonsense.
yeah, I know, right? Like, so they're machines are super convenient, and I think when your goal is to target specific muscles in hypertrophy, then that's great. We don't need to have an argument about what's functional or better for enhancing strength or what have you, because the goal is just to get a path to hypertrophy. Um, so I think while you should probably have those core group of a handful of compounds for the reasons I mentioned, machines can be a fantastic tool that allow you to, especially for muscle groups where you have trouble feeling them, it allows you to limit the number of degrees of freedom, if you will. So there's less things to focus on. Like, okay, if I do a free weight row, I have to really focus on keeping my torso stable so that I don't cheat as I deal with that strength curve, right? That is getting unfavorable as it's getting close to my body. But if I get a row, now I can just pull harder, and I have a chest supported row, for example, and it really allows you to, you can watch your butt wiggle and your feet kick up a little bit, but it's really not going to help you. So ultimately, any quote unquote cheating you do is ineffective. So it allows you to put a little more effort into a movement, and you might find you get better results that way. So I think they're quite complementary, and in some cases they're, I wouldn't say essential, but they are really convenient so that you don't have to do some crazy crap to train certain muscle groups, like trying to find a way to do like a leg curl or a leg extension when you don't have access to them. It looks like doing Nordics, finding a GHR, and you may or may not be strong enough to do that, or doing sissy squats or like sled backpedaling. And yeah, that looks great at a functional training place, but ultimately, like, how is it so nice to sit down and just change the cams around so it lines up with your knee and go to town on leg extensions, right? So I think cables and machines are really helpful, and they also sometimes get those benefits of giving you a different strength and tension curve.
Yeah, and just imagining someone just sled backpedaling on their back lane. Just the neighbors looking at you. Yeah, and then so I know we've touched on this a little bit in terms of the importance of knowing anatomy and all of that. But what are your thoughts on isolating specific parts of a muscle? People will commonly talk about, the short head versus the long head of the biceps, or your upper pecs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between theory and application here. And the easy answer is that when you're dealing with muscles with multiple heads that actually have different anatomical actions, they might as well be considered different muscles. Like short head and long head of the biceps femoris is a great example. Only one of them does knee flexion. So you could basically consider them separate muscles from the perspective of bodybuilding. But like short head and long head of the bicep on the humerus, that's kind of like you're curling, you're supinating. There's not a whole lot else going on there. It's I don't think it's very complicated how to train the biceps. Let's put it that way. Like how do I train the brachialis? Like flex your arm. There's really, that's all it does. It's gonna happen. So some muscles, it just does happen. You don't need to worry about it. However, I think it was probably taken too far in kind of the evidence-based quote unquote community, maybe like 10 years ago, where even the notion of like a muscle doing anything besides hypertrophying from, like attachment to insertion was bro science. And we actually have a ton of data showing that where tension is developed in a muscle is where you see more hypertrophy. So regional hypertrophy is 100% real. And it can be manipulated with changes of grip, changes in range of motion, changes in angles, all the above, and changes in exercise selection. So we actually have data showing that like incline press creates more EMG activity in the upper pec, for example. And that there's even one study I'm aware of that probably indicates greater hypertrophy, doing incline versus flat, for example. So I think it is worth, it's not worth really thinking that I must do this to train this muscle group, and I'm going to emphasize all these different little parts. But essentially, the mindset should be, you do need to understand anatomy a little bit, but I'm going to do some different angles. Like some things I don't think make sense, like changing your foot position on a leg press, for example, or they're not worth it. Like, and I mean like duck foot. I don't mean like taking a wider or closer stance, like moving your leg. But I've seen people just like, change their foot position or do things where I'm just more worried about their musculoskeletal health and not sure that's actually going to be doing anything to help them.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a difficult, without getting bogged down in the weeds and making this podcast go over an hour and talking about all the various exercises and what things do and don't make sense. Generally, it is true. Yes. Change of angles, grips, and exercise can change the regional contributions of muscle hypertrophy. And some of the old adages do make sense. Like you probably want to press in multiple planes. You probably want to pull in multiple planes. And then you probably will need to do some isolation work for the lower body because some of those cardinal compounds don't train certain muscle groups. Hamstrings aren't very active in a squat, even though the hamstrings do act as a hip extensor. They counteract the quadriceps, so they repeatedly have been shown not to hypertrophy very much and not to be very active on EMG. It's primarily glutes and quads. And the rectus femoris, because it's also a hip flexor, doesn't seem to be very active on a squat either. So what does that tell us? Well, if I was just doing squats and leg press and maybe back extensions, I probably should be doing some hamstring curls and leg extensions too, if I'm a bodybuilder. If I'm also doing deadlifts, maybe don't need to emphasize the hamstring work quite as much, but we also see that in deadlifts and hamstring curls, there's different regional activation between the upper and lower hamstring, proximal and distal. And like I said, the short head of the biceps femoris is the knee flexor. So, if you're not doing some knee flexion, is that getting trained? So I think understanding those things are important. If you understand the function of most of the muscles, that can help you get there. But some things are just people have beliefs about like the lower pec, and I have to do decline to develop that, and that's probably not true. And there's a bunch of examples where there isn't really a true delineation in the muscle, and the angle change doesn't even necessarily change where the regional emphasis is based on what people might say or think. Like, for example, wide grip pull-ups are for width and rows are for thickness. I don't think that's true. There's no reason to believe that. Both of them are doing shoulder extension and training the lats. So, just because you take a wide grip doesn't mean it's going to make you wider. That's kind of like that level of analysis is insufficient. Though. Yeah, it's true, right? So yeah, there's a number of times it's wrong, but the fundamental principle of regional hypertrophy is a thing and can be manipulated is not wrong. It's just that most people don't know how to manipulate it and get it done.
Yeah, that's great. The number of myths that are getting busted right now is insane. And if anyone else wants more myths busted, should check out Eric's books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids. So those very pointy things that we were alluding to earlier. So if you want a pointed analysis of how to get stronger and bigger, make sure you check that out.
Thank you.
Going on a little bit more to just zooming out more and talking about exercise variation.
Good question.
How many movements should people be incorporating for a muscle group?
That's a great question, and we definitely know that a super narrow exercise selection is probably inferior. There's actually a couple of studies now. One that just came out in July of last year by D'Souza, and then one that came out before that. Not by D'Souza. I'm sorry, I got the name wrong on that one. There is a study by, God, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's going to kill me. Where they did Smith machine squats only, or they compared a bunch of other ones. It'll come to me. But I think there's two studies I'm aware of where they looked at either the use of a singular exercise or multiple exercises to train different muscle groups. And they found that there was more robust and I would say complete hypertrophy across all the muscle groups when training in that manner with more exercises than one. So essentially, yes, if you want to hypertrophy all the muscles for, like, say, the squat's probably the best exercise to do that. But bodybuilders aren't trying to get really good at squats. They're trying to make their quads huge, and they use squats to emphasize that. So having a really narrow exercise selection is not the best way to do that. And I found the studies. Fonseca,
Nice.
It was killing me. I couldn't deal with it, not remembering it. So yeah, Fonseca and colleagues, what they did, it was 2014, and they had one group doing all of their volume on Smith machine squats, and then another group did Smith machine squats, deadlifts, lunges, and something else. I can't remember what all the different exercises were, but there was 4 versus 1 exercise. And while you saw similar global quadriceps hypertrophy, if you looked at the individual heads of the quadriceps, you saw more uniform hypertrophy in the group that did more exercises. So nothing was left out, essentially. And that has been replicated in a different manner recently by I'm probably going to mispronounce it, by Vasconcelos Costa, so Costa and colleagues. So it's been shown multiple times now that you probably need some degree of exercise variety. You don't want to simply have just like one exercise per muscle group. That's probably fine from like if you're a football player and trying to get bigger, like squats is your main quadricep exercise, that's fine, you know. But when you're trying to get a bodybuilding versus a hypertrophy program, there needs to be some degree of variety. On the flip side, though, variety doesn't mean randomization, and it doesn't mean constantly changing, and it doesn't mean that we need to emphasize like muscle confusion. There's a there's a known problem with being in the learning phase of doing an exercise. Like if you actually swap exercises out so much that you don't become an effective like practitioner, or you don't need to be like the master of squats, but you need to be like a jack of all trades for exercise as a bodybuilder. So there was a study by Chilibek and colleagues in the late 90s where they had bench press, leg press, and bicep curls. And they looked at changes in strength and hypertrophy at a pre, a mid, and a post test over 20 weeks in untrained women. So they went from basically untrained to novice, because 20 weeks is a long time. That's like, 5 months. And at the midpoint, they got stronger on curls, leg press, and bench, but they only saw hypertrophy in the biceps. So there was no hypertrophy in the muscles of the trunk or the legs yet. And that's because these are compound exercises. They require intramuscular coordination, and it takes more time. And they only saw hypertrophy in the trunk and the legs after the full 20 weeks of training them. So the idea is that while you're still learning the basics of a more complex movement, you're not able to actually stimulate the musculoskeletal system to really induce hypertrophy. Most of the strength gains you're making are coordination and motor learning. And then once you get an adequate level of coordination and motor learning, you actually can overload yourself. So, if you're rotating in, like variations of squats and deadlifts and other compound free weight movements, like every cycle, like every 3 weeks, that might be too frequent. You probably want to have some staples so that you're at least doing, once a week or once every 2 weeks, or maybe if you have shorter mesocycles, like 3-week blocks, like every other block or something like that. Essentially, you want to become a proficient weightlifter so that all the movements you do don't have this recurring learning effect that would actually delay the effectiveness. And a good way to know whether this is happening is, do you make rapid strength gains? Like, do you come in the first time, like let's say you just don't use high bar squats very often, or low bar squats. Let's say you just don't use squats. You normally like a leg press person. You bring them in every once in a while. And the first week you squat like 135, and then the next week you're up to like 225. That's, you didn't gain that much muscle in that week. That's probably just you figuring out how to do a squat again. So you should probably be seeing like very steady, small increases in load or the number of reps you can perform to know that, okay, this is actually I was able to actually efficiently stimulate myself that last time.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And yeah, when people, start off in bodybuilding, they hear about all about muscle confusion, and they feel like that they need to switch things up all the time. But yeah, there is a learning curve, and there's a few other things to keep in mind. Um, what would you say is the how should people think about swapping out exercises in terms of like the upper limit of how long to keep something in a program for?
Yeah, I think for isolation movements, they can do it honestly whenever they want. Like if you had a set, if you did tricep push downs last week and you came in today and that was bothering your elbow and you decided to go to overhead dumbbell extensions, I wouldn't care at all, to be honest. I don't think that makes a difference.
Hmm.
Um, and that is even backed by that study I just quoted. Like these novices saw bicep growth in the first 10 weeks of training. It's not hard to figure out how to flex your elbow.
Hmm.
So I think for isolation movements and machine movements and things that are not maybe compound machines, but the more simple a movement, the more or less the less technically demanding it is, you can swap it out more. You still want to be able to track progression, so it becomes a logistical issue rather than a ensuring it induces hypertrophy. But like if you do this exercise like every third week or randomly in your program, do you have a way of actually seeing where you were last time and ensuring progression? And are you going to progress on it? I would say for compound movements, I would keep them stable within mesocycle at the very least.
Hmm.
And if it's a compound movement that has a significant learning effect, it probably shouldn't be gone for more than one mesocycle. Like there's nothing wrong. Like if you're beat up from squats and deadlifts, take them out for 3 weeks. That's great. Bring them back in next mesocycle, and you can do back extensions and leg press to let your joints recover. Nothing wrong with that. I don't want
Hmm.
people to think like I can't go a week without squatting, but
Hmm.
at the same time, if you leave squats out for multiple months and you come back, you can expect to have to redo some of that learning.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. And yeah, I guess it's a good way to think about it as sort of having a pool of exercises that you find out work best for you, and having some variation in between them, but sort of having those staples largely in the picture.
Absolutely, it's well said.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we've covered a lot, and people are going to get a lot of value from this. Lots of myths busted, and lots of bodybuilders running to the forums to, vent about what Eric said about, changing grit widths and wider grit widths,
Just
non
here
making
to
for my lats. Oh man.
crush dreams and cause drama. That's all I do.
So yeah, anyways, wrapping up with a fun question. As an influencer, Eric, what are your current goals on social media?
On social media, it's to basically uh, keep people informed of like actual content. So I'm not someone who
Mhm.
produces a lot of content for social media. Most of the time, I'm doing exactly what Instagram doesn't want me to do, which is to say, "Hey, listen to this podcast," or "Hey, go read this article," or "Hey, check out this thing we're doing," or this free issue of Mass. Go to this other website. Get off the platform. Download a
Yeah.
PDF and read it, or go into iTunes and listen to this 2 hour thing. So I know it's not the best way to do it. Like if I really wanted to maximize my following, it would be to try to put out like really good content for Instagram. But I think that the platform's inherently limited, and what I do as a scientist and a quote unquote science communicator requires more depth than that. And if someone's on Instagram just to get green checks or red X's over exercise form, then they're probably not coming to me for that anyway. So that I don't see that as an issue. But yeah, generally it's a nice way to communicate. I have done more like IG lives on there and answer questions. I think Q&A is great on social media. That allows you to 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 give people content that is useful and helpful and can have an appropriate level of depth to the question without necessarily being limited by the platform or ask people to leave it, which typically nerfs your engagement. So yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging when you're trying to go on Instagram and actually try and give people like meaningful, deep content, especially coming from a science-based background. So yeah, I like how your social media is sort of a hub of, where people can go there and find other sources. So, and yeah, I think in a lot of ways I try and do that as well through this podcast, and connecting people with the resources that matter. So
Absolutely.
that being said, I think we'll wrap this up. Where should people find you, Eric?
Well, thanks again for having me on. Always good discussions. And you can find me at 3dmusclejourney.com along with the rest of the crew. There's links to the pointy objects that I sell as books. There's links to monthly applications in strength sport if you want to read about science regularly. We've got our anniversary sale going on right now. It's the lowest price it ever is. And that's going on through May 4th, I believe. So hopefully this podcast comes out before then, or you're just going to be disappointed by hearing about it. But that's those are the main places. And then I'm also on Iron Culture podcast. And then you can follow me at Helms 3DMJ if you want to have me tell you to get off Instagram and go watch, read, or listen to something.
Great. So we'll put those links in the description. Thanks again for being on, Eric.
My pleasure, man.